This is the Real J.L. Moseman podcast.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for listening to the Real J.L. Moseman podcast. Thank you for supporting. You can get more information and support the show by going to my website, jlmoseman.net. Get on and get part of the conversation by going to real at real_JL Moseman, and find me on Facebook, The Real JL Moseman. I gotta admit, this podcast is going to be one of the ones for the ages, because it's been probably the hardest podcast I've ever had to do, because there's so much stuff I want to say, and I'm trying to make my thoughts concise, because that matters here. Because we can't mince words. We can't not be as clear as humanly possible as we can be when it comes to the issues at hand in this topic of debate on this podcast. I've had to whittle about 5 hours of podcast audio down into one podcast, and it's been a tremendous struggle. But I think I've got it for you. And what you're going to hear after the break is the finished, polished process of that podcast, and I'm very thankful and very proud of it. I know that I'm going to say things in it that you're going to disagree. Some of you will agree. It's going to be emotional. It's going to be tense. It's going to be basically my heart out on a sleeve. And I know that it puts me at great risk. Because in this generation, in this era, in our society now, to speak truth, to speak what your opinion is, unless it's a particular opinion that supports an agenda that's really popular now, means to incur the wrath of many people. In this podcast, I'm going to be talking about transgendered bathrooms, but I'm going to be talking more about than just transgendered bathrooms, because at the end, it's not about transgenders and it's not about bathrooms. What it is about a group of people trying to promote their ideals. And while they may have points, and I'm willing to listen to their points, the mere fact that they're unwilling to listen, and the mere fact that they are so fanatical, so fundamentalistic, and so completely bonkers, it makes one who is rational say, I can't do this anymore. Now, I'm going to break a rule that I normally don't do. I don't really talk about homosexuality. I don't really talk about the LGBT community, because I think it's a delicate issue. And I will openly admit that conservative Christians have not always been the best on this topic. In fact, we've said some bad things. We need to consider the dignity of people of the LGBT community. I don't want to deny that. And I don't want to deny them rights. But I don't want to give them special privileges. And that's what it comes down to. What it comes down to also is liberal hypocrisy. What it comes down to is social justice warriors who are so fanatical, who will do anything in their power to get their agenda completed, that whoever sacrifices whatever, everything else be damned. We're talking about people who are supposedly talking about being anti-discrimination and for equality and for morality, and they're for none of those things. We're talking about people who are supporting Orwellian concepts like some animals are more equal than others. We're talking about a group of people who will espouse something like white privilege, but then deny the reality of black privilege. We're talking about a group of people who want to say that you can't say something about a whole group, but then say a whole thing about another group. About people like Bruce Springsteen, who say that it's okay for him to not have concerts and to do business, his business, which is to put on concerts and make records, to go to a state and do business because he disagrees with them, because he thinks they're wrong. And yet, to be on the ass of the baker who says the same thing. We're talking about people who are so biased. We're talking about a group of people who are so unwilling to do the right thing and to be intellectually honest that it sickens me. And the era we're in now of this post-modern fascism and the fact that millennialism, the millennials have all but goggled it up and spit it out, frightens and scares me. We're talking about a group of people who will talk about the evils of the military-industrial complex, and I agree with them to a point. And we're talking about a group of people who are so much against the corporations, and I do agree to a point, and against the established Wall Street and all that, and cronyism and all that, but then say nothing, or worse, support and defend the abortion industrial complex that kills babies and harvests their body parts, that helps cover up rapes of minority women, and then at the same time tells me that I'm a bigot and a racist because I don't support Black Lives Matter, or that I have concerns, or I say, hey, you know what? I think people who are voicing concerns about how we use the language of a bill and how we use the language about who can use a bathroom and who doesn't get to use a bathroom, that somehow I'm the bigot, is the biggest horse crap I've ever heard in my life. And it is the lie of the century. The LBG community is now where the feminist movement was 10, 15, 20 years. Espousing the same old idea that if I want something, I should have it. You should give me what I want. And if you don't, consequences be damned. We're talking about a lot of different things. We're talking about the death of critical thinking. We're talking about all sorts of things. We're talking about liberal progressivism. It is the blight of the age. And it espouses all the tenets and all the understandings of what it means to be mentally ill. And while I want to try to advocate certain things, and I want to try to be moderate, and I want to try to be reasonable, you can't be reasonable with mentally ill people. You can't be reasonable with fanatics. That's what this podcast is about. And that's what I've prepared for you, and I hope you enjoy it. I try so hard to take what I have recorded and put it in there for you. So, don't go anywhere. The J.L. Moseman Podcast, the real J.L. Moseman Podcast. We'll be right back. Hello, everyone. This is the real J.L. Moseman Podcast. We're back. So I've got a show for you today. It's not going to be easy, but it will be rewarding. And at the end of the podcast, it will be honest. I come to you now to tell you that if you pride yourself as a reasonable, critical thinking, critical, analytical, logical person, if you think of yourself as a well-rounded person, if you desire to understand things from an objective truth, if you see the problems that fundamentalism, fascism, feminism have brought to us, if you've seen the uprising of social justice warriors and their bull crap, this is your podcast. If you're that person I just described, you've got to be just like me and going out of your mind. Because really, it seems that we're in hell. To me, hell has always been a place of insanity. You lose your mind. And right now, we're losing our mind as a nation, as a society. Now, I get there's going to be heated discussions. There's going to be passionate emotions. We're in the verge of transforming as a society. For those who don't want the transformation, wake up to it. It's happening. Transformation can be good, but it can also be bad. People want to continue to tell us on the left that we got to keep on going forward. But what is the point of going forward if you can't look back? As the old adage goes, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And that's absolutely true. If you've not known your history, and if you've not studied, especially Nazi Germany, then you're going to want to listen to this podcast. You're going to want to pay attention to what I have to say to you. Because it matters. At the end of World War I, the people of Germany were fatigued. Not only had they seen many of their countrymen die of war, but they found themselves with a burden that was financially strapped onto them by other nations in what was then the precursor to the United Nations. The Allied forces, those being America and England, tried to do something which they ultimately failed at. They put such a huge financial burden on the people of Germany so that they would be punished for their war and that they would never go back to war. But it was the catalyst for the Nazi uprising. It was the precursor for fundamentalistic fanaticism to breed. Before you know it, decent, hard-working Germans started to turn on each other. A young, impressive, provocative politician spoke of the ills of society and deemed to blame it on one group. A group of people who were the symbol of everything wrong in that society. The Jews. They had the money. They had put so many things on burden of the German people as it was perceived. They were the menace. And so as times got bad and the fanatical leader started to get more and more support, good, decent German people started to turn a blind eye to what was then the beginning of an oppression upon a segment of its population. That oppression would not just end with throwing the Jews into the concentration camps and the ghettos in their own country. It would also go to invading other countries and attacking other Jews in other countries It would go to leading to a huge world war, which would bring upon numbers of death around the world. And it all started with an idea that the woes of a society could be judged based off of one group. People stopped using critical thinking. People stopped using their logic and their thoughts. They started to think not for themselves, but along the party line. Nazism swelled. It even took root in other places like America. And before you know it, a whole people were being persecuted and annihilated. But it wasn't just the Jews, it was also the homosexuals, Christians, and other unwanted people, or people who were perceived as the problem. Because it was easy to blame all the problems on some people. The emotional outrage of a society led to a mob rule and allowed a select few to dominate the country and to plunge it into a world war. What we see with Nazi Germany is what could happen again in America. We already have leaders who are stoking up the flames, stoking up the language that would heat up the conversation, that would go beyond reason, that would go beyond consistent, consecutive, constructive, analytical thinking. And now we're at a crossroads in America where we could very well repeat those same sins. And now, no matter what the progressive secular left want to tell you, Christians have become the new unwanted. One has to wonder how long it would take to create new ghettos and concentration camps for them. And if you think America doesn't put people in concentration camps, then all you need to do is look to Japan and look to the Japanese Americans, because we did it. In fact, there's one about an hour and a half away from where I live. It's all but ruins now, but it's still there. I've been there, I've seen it. It doesn't take much for a people who pride themselves on a constitution and an ideal of freedom, equality, an idea that what equality means equal opportunity. America has been plunging itself further and further into the problems that we see in socialism. The problems that we see in feminism, fanaticism, and fundamentalism. But for you on the conservative right, who are now just waking up to this reality, I only need to tell you that you have been doing it too. Because the fundamentalism in the evangelical Christian society has been brewing for a long time. And it wasn't too long ago when Christians were persecuting people too. To say that we've never done it would be a gross error. To say that we've never used heated language and stoked the flames of emotional responses would be intellectually dishonest and counterproductive. But I offer this to my critics and to the critics of Christianity. This isn't a byproduct of Christianity. This is a byproduct of being a human being. Because human beings, by the by, will always be prone to the same things. And the elite tyrants will always be prone to using the same approaches. We're seeing a new Gestapo and the new Nazism. And it's priding itself with rainbow colors. It's donning itself with men dressing up as women, showing gratuitous sexual acts, and calling it a pride festival or a parade. It's telling us that equality is only attained by denying other people's rights. And while emotionally, on the surface, it would feel good, there is a movement about in the LGBT community that is stirring a monster so bad that it could lead to those problems I mentioned earlier. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not accusing everybody in the LGBT community of being this. I'm not saying, because again, I don't blame Christianity for it. I don't blame the feminists, although there's a lot of things within feminism that's caused this problem, but it isn't because it's feminism in itself in its original form, because feminism in its original form was great. And I'm not talking about 60s feminism either. I'm talking about feminism from the turn of the century. I'm talking about the original ideas. You see, fundamentalism and fanaticism warps anything it takes on. It did to socialism and communism. It's done it to Christianity. It's done it to feminism. And now it's doing it to the LGBT community and the whole quote-unquote tolerance movement. The people who are espousing that we be tolerant are so fervently intolerant to those who disagree. And now the latest war, the latest battleground for this war, is in bathrooms. Don't get me wrong. I do not want to discredit anyone for having the desire to be able to use a restroom. I mean, come on. There are times when you're going to be out there in the public and you're going to want to use the restroom. It's simple. You're going to want to. People should have the right to use the restroom in peace, or to the best of their ability. Understanding it's still a public restroom, and that, who can ever get comfortable in that? There are good intentions on both sides of this issue. There's good points. And while I personally don't agree with transgender people, I don't believe, I understand that there are people who feel that way. I don't want to discredit their feelings. I think that there are certain hormones and chromosomes and stuff like that that play into that, so I think there's a legitimate element to transgenderism. I don't believe in necessarily the idea, though, that if you feel like you're a woman and you put on a wig and you put on makeup, that you're a woman. Just like I don't believe someone who says, I'm a black person, that if you're not a black person, you don't say that you're a black person. The progressive left is telling us why. People be whoever they want. Who are you to be intolerant? Who are you to be a bigot? Who are you to say they can't? I don't know. Maybe objective reality. Maybe truth. Now, I'm not disputing the fact that they have those feelings, and I'm not even saying whether or not those I'm not even accrediting or adding anything to their fact that they're feeling that way. They could feel that way. I'm not saying they shouldn't feel that way. I'm not saying that. I'm saying just because you feel like you're something doesn't mean you are. If I got on here and said, I'm a gay Native American man, I wouldn't be, just because I say it. Doesn't mean there's not real Native Americans, and it doesn't mean there ain't real gay people. It means just to say it doesn't mean anything. But you see, the progressive left doesn't understand this, or maybe they don't care. The reality is, they believe in a philosophy that says as long as you make an accusation, it doesn't matter if you prove it or not, you just make the accusation. And if you seem to be something, then you are. Anyone who's objective, anyone who prides themselves in being critical thinkers would know that you have to have evidence and facts. And the fact that some of my atheist friends are on board on this makes me scratch my head. How are you skeptics? How are you the true, critical, logical thinkers on this? The reality is, you're exposing something I've always known for a long time, that no human being is immune to bias, and no human being is immune to emotional rationalism, which tells us that something is rational because we feel it. The reality is, just because you think you're something doesn't mean you are. But with that point aside, I've made that point. Here's the thing. It's a difficult issue. And I think we need to all accept that. And I think we all need to accept that there is an alternative solution to some of the things that we think. We could sit down and figure this out. And I would imagine that to some extent there are probably people right now who are transgendered, who are using your public restroom, and those who are giving a whole hellabook about it don't even know it. But we're not really talking about the legitimate transgender people here. And the law in North Carolina really isn't talking about people who've probably gone... in fact, it isn't. It's not talking about people who have gone through the process, who've done it. It's talking about how we perceive transgender. How do we define it? And we have to be careful when we make a law about that. It's hard to police bathrooms, and it's hard to say who should look up whose skirt to see who's really something, because that would be an invasion of privacy. At the same time, we know another solution that wouldn't work. We also know that saying this is a transgender bathroom would be kind of the same thing as saying this is a colored bathroom. We don't want segregation either. I don't want to deny a transgender person their right to use a public restroom, but I also don't want to deny a parent or a child the right to not have to be exposed to something. And I'm not saying that they necessarily would. I'm not saying that that would be really the biggest problem. Who knows? It could be. I don't know. I can't say that definitively. I can only speculate. But I think it is still a credible enough concern for people. And whether you believe in that concern or not, that's one thing. Okay, you don't have to. That's fine. But what you can't do, Stephen Van Sant, or any other of you liberals out there, is call it evil, or call it bigotry, or call it xenophobia, or call it whatever the hell you want, because you're doing now the same thing that you're doing. You're accusing someone of something just because that's what you feel, or that's because what you think. And it's not based on anything objective. It's not bigotry to have concerns about that. We were told the same thing with the Syrian refugees. And there are still people today who still think, well, you know what? There's not a problem with Islam. Liberalism, well, not all liberalism. There's parts of liberalism. I would call the Bill Maher faction of liberalism that's starting to wake up to the fact that there's a bigger culprit and a bigger problem to these kinds of problems that we have, and that is radical Islam, which is fundamentalism in its worst form on the planet Earth. I will tell you that right now. I say, you know, look, there's a bigger problem. But liberals don't want to see that. They want to get on board, even though the Muslims are the worst. Bryan Adams has no problem going to Qatar or Saudi Arabia or Middle East, but you know, where they stone women if they get raped. But hey, let's not go to Mississippi, because we want protection of liberty. And I agree, the religious liberty laws are tricky. I'm not going to pretend we can say one thing or the other on that. I can say there's valid points on both sides, and there's a thin line. The LGBT people are right to say there's a thin line between what you espouse as a religious right and what is actually discrimination. And we do have laws, and those laws have to be followed. You can't discriminate someone from a job because of their race or their color or their sexuality or whatever. And you can't discriminate someone from getting a student loan. Or those are some of the more fundamental things. Does that mean someone has to cater their business to you because they want to? I don't think someone, if they don't want that choice, they should be able to make that choice, because, you know, I think it's very funny that that people on the left are all about choice, except for when it means the choice of having your own weapon to defend yourself, whether it means the choice to have what you do with your property, or the choice to put your kids in private education. Okay, those choices don't matter to them, right? But pro-choice, the choice to slaughter your unborn child and sell its body parts, well, that's okay. But I find it funny that the parties, the liberal Democratic Party of choice, and other progressives, that they're supposedly all about the party, all about they're all about the choice, right? They're all about people's choices. That they deny people's choices to say, I don't necessarily want my child to be exposed to that, or I don't want my child to see something, or I don't want to cater my business. But then Bruce Springsteen is okay in saying he doesn't want to do a rock concert. Now, I know the progressive left says it's different, but it isn't. Well, he's doing that because they're discriminating people, okay? That I'm not saying that it's the exact same reason. Duh, duh, duh. I'm saying it's the exact same act. He is deciding to use his own moral judgment to not to do his business, which is putting on concerts, because he disagrees with something or someone. That's exactly what's going on with the bakers. And even though I think a lot of the bakers these Christian bakers hey, I don't want to do it. Well, to me, I think that baking a cake is your calling. You should do what your calling is, and I don't want to ever take away someone's right to deny it and go with their conscience, but I also know that it isn't as big of a problem as you might think it is. I know other conservatives are going to disagree with me, and that's fine. In the end, it's all about sin, and we're all equal opportunity sinners, and we're all equal in our own heinous sin, and we all equally rely on Jesus Christ's grace and his suffering and his death. So guess what? That's where I stand on that. But the thing of it is I don't even care about some of these things as much as I do care about the left being bigots. Because they're the ones that are being the real bigots. They're the ones who are being bigots to people who disagree with them. They're the ones who want to trample on other people's rights to decide what they want their child to see or not to see. They're the ones who are being hypocritical. And this is a problem. This has been a big problem. And it doesn't just extend to the LGBT community, although this is where it's brewing right now. And a lot of it is because there is this idea of privilege. You know, it's funny that the people who are telling us about white privilege all of a sudden espouse a lot about LGBT privilege. We're not talking about that privilege, are we? They want to tell us that there's white privilege, but they don't want to tell us that there's also black privilege. Because right now we've got liberal professors out there saying people can't sing a song from a black artist if they're white, and they're telling us that if you're a white person you can't wear dreadlocks. Which is all bullcrap anyways. Because if that's the case, if we're going to go down that line, then anybody who wants to use most of the basic things that we've invented, electricity, telephone, all that's been invented by white people. So how about blacks and gays and Latinos step the fuck off and stop using that stuff? And I'm sorry to use my language there, but this is the point I'm trying to make. They're so bound in this inconsistency of what they think, of what they feel is right. Oh, you gotta respect that's a black. You know, actually, I'm kind of starting to agree with them because it has been the progressive left that has been trying to co-opt white culture into becoming more acceptive of other cultures. And now all of a sudden, when they start talking and acting like them, well, then we can't have that. Well, I agree. White people should act like white people. But you know what? You're the ones that started this in the first place. So you can't whine now that you've had 20 years to push this. But, you know, let's not talk about all the things that have happened for black people and all the things that happen for LGBT people. And let's not talk about the fact that there are places in the world right now that are lobbing off people's heads if they're Christians, stoning women if they're raped, not allowing women to vote, and doing other things to people who openly come out as homosexuals. In fact, that's probably a hard thing to do in the Muslim world. So let's not talk about that. Let's not talk about the fact, you know, when it comes to issues like immigration, that you're talking about us white people being xenophobes if we're against immigration, yet you don't say that about Japanese. who have very more strict immigration laws than we do. It's inconsistency is what it is. It's hypocrisy is what it is. And this is why liberals aren't meant to be social justice warriors. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. All right, we're back. So let's talk about liberals and why they shouldn't be social justice warriors. You know, the reason, there's about, I would say, 3 good reasons why they shouldn't be social justice warriors. The first one is that they're hypocrites. And hypocrites aren't the kind of people you want to align yourself with as social justice. People who are hypocrites are, all in all, they're unable to be able to talk about issues with any kind of credibility. Especially if you're going to be using the calling card of social justice. You know, social justice is something that I feel is important to some degree, but not the way that the progressive have deigned it to be. So, here's the thing. Here's reasons why the left is hypocritical when it comes to social justice. Well, we just explained one part of that, being that they don't care about people who don't agree with transgendered, who don't want their kids to be in a toilet next to a grown man, who are worried about any kind of perverts or pedophilia, that kind of stuff happening. Now, that's not to say that any of that is credible or not. We'll talk about that later. But I mean, we talked about that already. But the idea that they would be hypocritical about someone else's rights and not those people's rights, that's the issue there. They are hypocritical. One of the biggest people I know that's hypocritical, among other things, trust me, other things, is Hillary Clinton. I have here in my, stealing from Rush Limbaugh, my stack of stuff with my never-stained nicotine hands. I have a quote from Miss Hillary Clinton. I read this on the Christian Post. By the way, links for everything that I read on here will be on the page that I post for the blog and on for the podcast. She said this though. She said, quote, "It's time we face up to the reality of the systematic racism in all forms. And once we do, we are called to come together and break down all the barriers that still hold African Americans back from participating in our economy and our society, and together to build ladders of opportunity and empowerment in their place." First of all, you know, she never gives any examples of what systematic racism is. And this is going to go back to another reason why they shouldn't be social justice warriors. It's that they are enabled to be critical thinkers. And you have to be critical thinking, and you have to be able to communicate well what your points are. And if you just say them in a vacuum, well, that's just rhetoric. It's just buzzwords. She doesn't give any examples of systematic racism in all its forms. I hope she's talking about the systematic racism that is occurring now, where white people aren't given certain privileges because of their color. But I'm sure she's not talking about that. She talks about blacks from fully participating. Well, fully? Well, what does she mean by fully? I mean, the way she makes it sound is if we have laws that black people can't own businesses. They can't own, they have to cap them at a certain amount of money they can make. I don't know what the hell she's talking about when it comes to participating in our economy. I agree that black people do struggle more than a lot of other people, but a lot of that has to do with poverty, and and low education, and a lot of that has to do with generational poverty. A lot of that, by the way, has to do with the fact that a lot of blacks in inner cities like New York and Detroit, they have been run historically by liberals, and they have screwed the muck. And they have done everything they can to ruin the education system. They've done everything they can to tax the heck out of a place where businesses have to leave out of it. So, I mean, come on. How about you look at your own failed policies before you blame systematic racism, Hillary Clinton? She talks about empowering people. Oh, okay, that's good. Okay, fine. Empower them. But here's the reality. She's being hypocritical because when we get to this next phrase, listen to what she has to say. I have said many times white Americans need to do a much better job of listening when African Americans talk about seen and unseen barriers we face every day. First of all, I love the fact that she calls it we as if she's black, but I guess her husband was the first black president, so I guess she is black. Or, she is whatever she has to be in order to win. But here's the thing. She's talking about the fact that we white people aren't listening to African Americans. And that we also, here she goes, she says we need to recognize our privilege and practice humility rather than assume our experiences are everyone else's. Okay, well, aren't you being a little hypocritical here? Because aren't you basically making the claim that black people, all black people, are disenfranchised and are victims of systematic racism? Are you saying that all black people are not able to fully participate in the economy? I don't know. People like Oprah and Beyonce and, more and more names I can name, they don't seem to be part of that, do they? You see, but that's the whole thing. I know she's an ideologue. I know she's someone who's going to say things in a vacuum, and I know some hipster millennial has written this thing for her. But the reality is, that's a hypocritical statement to make. Who are you to say all black people have that experience? And so this just goes to example what I'm trying to say. But that's more pearls of wisdom from the great Hillary Clinton. Of course, Hillary Clinton is bonkers. Okay, so another reason I just kind of mentioned it now, was that they don't have critical thinking. And critical thinking is also important because it allows you to be able to speak critically. Liberals are so worried about sensitivity and about the appearance of what things are and how and how you say it, and if you say something that someone's not going to like, well, then it's going to hurt their feelings. You can't be a true social justice warrior if you are not willing to break a few eggs to make an omelet. That's my attempt at being a joke. And a good example of this is Bernie Sanders. So now he had a supporter at one of his rallies, and he was talking beforehand. The guy's name is Paul Y. Sung, and he said, quote, hold on, I'm getting it right here. He said, quote, Medicare for all will never happen if we continue to elect corporate Democratic whores who are beholden to big pharma and the private insurance industry instead of us. Now, there's so much to say about that statement. But there was a lot of controversy and hubby-hub about it. Paul Young went on to apologize, so did Bernie Sanders, right? Because if someone says it at a Bernie Sanders rally, well then, yeah. But they don't want to take accountability for the fact that they're starting riots at Trump events, so who cares, right? Now, here's the thing. When you're saying something critical, you're just got to say something that sometimes is biting, sometimes it is harsh. But as long as it fits in the context, and you're not using it as a personal slant or a fallacy or an inhabitant, or, if you're not doing it that way, then I don't see a problem with him using the word whore. I really don't. He wasn't saying Hillary Clinton's a whore. Now, you might draw that conclusion from what he said, because you might say, well, Bernie Sanders is going up against Hillary Clinton, and thus, he could call her a whore. But there's a key word here that has to be said. And see, this is a good reason why liberals shouldn't be social justice warriors, because they're unable to understand context of words. They're not able to understand. And if you can't understand what someone's saying, how the heck can you promote anything? He said horse. That's the key word. It was plural. Horse. Now that works. Like, for example, who other than a whore best exemplifies someone who sells himself, who sells their ideas, right? What do you say? Obviously, he's using it for effect, dramatic effect, to make his point. But it works. Whores. People who sell themselves are whores. And if you're saying that, quote, Medicare for all will never happen if we continue to elect corporate Democratic whores who are beholden to Big Pharma and the private insurance industry instead of us. Again, I can understand how it might seem to be about her, and maybe he was slighting her there. Who knows? I can't say for 100% certainty that I know exactly what his intentions are with saying it. I have to only go by the context of the language, something that liberals don't understand. And I have to look at, say, what is he actually saying here? He's saying horse. He's saying it in comparison to people who are Democrat, who are beholden to Big Pharma and private insurance industry. Now, if you are so sensitive to the plight of whores, if you are a whore, well, first of all, I think the greater slant isn't on Hillary Clinton or Democrats. I think the greater slant here is on whores, because if I was a whore, I wouldn't want to be called a Democrat. But I'm bunch. Sorry. But, if there's a better word that we could use for this, please tell me. Please tell me. I don't think there is. I guess there would be a kind of a word you call it. Let's see here. Medicare for all will never happen if we continue to elect corporate Democratic politicians. Ooh. Well, that would be the truth, and we don't really say that, right? Because, see, if he's saying whores, and he's saying that they're Democratic whores, and they're actually whores that happen to be Democrat, and therefore that's the problem, not Democratic values or ideas, but that they would be politicians. Maybe politicians is a good word for that. I don't know. But whores works. And if we can't say what's on our mind, if we can't say something and make a comment. It's funny. The Bernie Sanders campaign has been all about trying to make Bernie out to being someone that Jesus would vote for, which, who knows really who Jesus would vote for. I do know he says, my kingdom is not of this earth, so I don't think he would concern himself with the Jew from Vermont. But they always try to make him like the candidate for Jesus. That's what they're trying to sell him. The thing of it is, Jesus would probably be okay with that language. And I'm being honest. Because in biblical times, what he called the bankers, the money exchangers in the temple, Bernie Sanders should be all for that. But see, if Jesus was saying that today and he was associated with Bernie Sanders' campaign, than the sensitive Democrats, who are especially the Democratic Party people who know that Hillary actually is somewhat selling herself out. Not that she is a whore in the sense that she's selling her body out sexually, but that she will sell her identity out, her politics out for whoever, whatever, that's what they say. We don't want to say that because she's a woman and she's so fine and she's the great person to run for president, even though she deserves to be in the big house. Yeah, no. Liberals, if you can't just get over yourselves on some of this stuff, how can you really be the one to say, over there, that's a problem? Because the reality is they've got the problem themselves. But let's continue. That, by the way, was from the source that I got on that paper. On that was from CNN, and it's CNN condemns supporters' whore comment. People said, very disgusting language, to say the least. Bernie Sanders should disavow Jennifer Palmieri, Clinton's communication director. Yeah. Well, I think there's some other things that Clinton's communication director should disavow that I think Clinton should disavow. Maybe tell her about that. Anyways, going on. Another reason why the left, the liberal left, is unable to be the guardians of social justice is because as long as they make up things like white privilege, Now, first of all, is there privileges to being white? Yeah. If you're born rich white, yeah. But that isn't about being white. That's about being rich. I'm very poor. I'll be out there and tell you right now, I'm pretty poor. Okay? And there's no privilege to me being white. In fact, I'm pretty sure that I could probably go back to college, get my education paid for, and get a better shot of getting a job if I put on my applications that I was black. Who knows? But I digress. The thing of it is this. There are a lot of things out there that people are misunderstanding here. And for the progressive left, this idea that there are made-up things like microaggression, there's another form of aggression that the left is really good at doing, and that's called passive aggressiveness. And until you get that figured out, I really think you should probably watch what you're saying. But they have to create these things, right? They have to create these problems that people have, right? Now, the problems people have are legitimate. There's no doubt that we need to do something in our justice system because there's too many black people in prison. And part of that is has been racism. I don't want to ever say that there has not been racism. And I'm never going to say that there hasn't been a point in time in this country's history where if you're traveling in a car at 1 o'clock in the morning and you get pulled over, the likelihood of it being black and being spotted by the police versus you being white could impact that. Obviously, when you have situations like the Rodney King's beating, it's evidence that stuff happens. But when you make up things like white privilege and systematic racism, even though it's contrary to what the truth is. In fact, since we've gotten rid of segregation, the country has done almost everything it can to help black people. We could do more, I agree. But that's not something that has to do with the fact that we need to give them handouts. I mean, if anything, that would be the worst thing, because that's kind of like the mentality now. If you want to help the black person, first of all, you need to get the black family unit back together. It has been broken for so long, and it's been destroyed by feminism and by liberalism. So they've aided in the destruction of the black man and the black community. But to say there's systematic racism is just a preposterous claim. And people like the Black Lives Matter, here's the thing. If we go back to Michael Brown, we go back to what happened there in Ferguson, he was an a-hole punk. And a-hole punks that pull a-hole punk things are going to get a-hole punk things done to them. And that doesn't justify his death. That doesn't justify anything. It's about cause and effect. Right? This is where critical thinking comes back into it. You got to be able to think, oh yeah, me acting like an idiot and me throwing myself at a cop may not do something. But you know what? The biggest culprit for the reason why the black community has been destroyed, besides family, has been education. And who's been in charge of that? Who's made it unionized? I'll give you one guess. With these reasons, they tell us perfectly why whenever the secular left, the left, want to start piping down on secular, when they start piping down on social justice causes, we only need to do one thing, and that's tell them to shut the hell up. All right, I got a couple other more stories that we're going to follow up on here. We're going to talk about in the next segment. We're going to talk. I've been hearing a lot of people misunderstanding what the Electoral College is all about. We're going to clear that up, and I'm going to talk about this podcast from this pastor Craig Groeschel, who does a podcast about his church, and it's about mega churches and leadership building, and most of the time, people like that are they all ascribe to the Peter Drucker way of evangelism, quote unquote. And I usually don't like big mega church people, but he makes a great comment that I think is worth Christians listening to. So don't go anywhere. The J.L. Moseman podcast, the real J.L. Moseman podcast, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the program. Alright, so I got that stuff off my shoulder, and again, I just had to talk about it, because there are things we can talk about, and there's things we can't. And I almost feel like it's getting harder and harder to talk reasonably to the progressive left. Okay, we're going to move on. I have, I have been very, very disappointed with politics and how the party works. But people are confused about the Electoral College. And I think that it's high time that people who say that the Electoral College should be disavowed should get some facts. This is from the U.S. government page, from their archives, archives.gov. The Electoral College is a process, not a place. The Founding Fathers established it in the Constitution, so it's constitutional, as a compromise between the election of the President by the vote in the Congress and election of the President by a popular vote of qualified citizens. The Electoral College process consists of the selection of electors, the meeting of the electors where they vote for the President and Vice President, and the counting of the electoral votes by college. The Electoral College consists of 538 electors. A majority of 270 Electoral College is required to elect the President. Your state's entitled allotment of electors equals the number of members in its congressional delegation. 1 for each member of the House of Representatives, plus 2 for your senators. Read more about the allocation of electoral votes. Click here. That's what it says. Under the 23rd Amendment of the Constitution, the District of Columbia is allocated 3 electors and treated like a state for the purposes of the Electoral College. For this reason, in the following discussion, the word state also refers to the District of Columbia. Each candidate running for president in your state has his or her own group of electors. The electors are generally chosen by the candidate's political party, but state laws vary on how the electors are selected and what their responsibilities are. Most states have a winner-take-all system that rewards the electors to the winning presidential candidate. However, Maine and Nebraska each have a variation of proportional presentation. There's a misconception that there isn't a majority vote in the states when it comes to electing. We know this now because the reason I'm coming up with this is because I live in Colorado, and Colorado's come up on the national scene because Trump has been making a fuss about the process here. And while I think that there could be a more uniformed way of the rules committees to deal with this in each party, the reality is, especially when it comes to like the general election, this is not an issue of the Electoral College. People are blaming the Electoral College, and they're always blaming the Electoral College. They're saying we should get rid of it because it allows for people to vote on something. No. You don't understand how it works. I'm telling you right now, this is how it works. If your state gets the majority of vote, it gets its electors. It's simple. That's how it goes. Essentially, having the Electoral College means that each state has votes. Those votes matter. It gives states like New York and California, states like Florida, states like Ohio that are big states that have a lot of people, it gives them a lot of power. But it doesn't give them so much power that because if we had like just a basic like a popular vote, we would end the election after we tallied the Eastern Coast votes. Presidential nominees would not come to different states and different communities to vote. They would not have to earn the support of states like Iowa, like Colorado, like Arizona, like Wyoming. The process allows the states to have a popular vote, to allow a winner of the state by popular vote to get those electoral votes. There's an idea that the Electoral College interferes with the popular vote. It's not necessarily true. Of course, there was the issue back in 2000 with Bush about him not having enough of the popular vote. But what should elect a president isn't the popular vote. What's popular for New Yorkers in Florida shouldn't determine who is the president for the other 48 states. The electoral process allows for people to care about the issues, or supposedly, that's what we're supposed to happen. It probably did at one point. Now, I don't know. But that's not the fault of the Electoral College. It's the fault of the party political machines. It's the fault of people not holding their politicians accountable. The Electoral College is something that allows for each state to contribute something. Because out of the 538 votes, or excuse me, electors, and needing at least 270, you need a lot of states to win that way. With the popular vote, you could win with Florida, New York, California, and guess what? Right now, they all tend to be liberal, or liberal-leaning. Imagine this, because it usually tends to be fucking liberals, excuse my French, who are the ones who have problems with the Electoral College. Imagine, if you will, the biggest states being conservative and supporting issues you don't agree with, like pro-life and anti-gay marriage. You think you'd want that to win by a popular vote? The idea that people say about popular votes is, I'll have the popular vote because I like that. That's the way it should be. It should be the majority. No. Because a majority doesn't require much. It doesn't require a president to go to a lot of states. And it doesn't give each state a little bit of power, a little bit of purpose. Each party in each state, I mean, they work hard to get whatever candidate, especially when after the primaries happen, whatever candidate from whatever party to get them worked on. So if you don't have that, no. If you get away with the Electoral College, say sayonara to local grassroots mattering. It won't matter. Maybe in a few highly populated places it might, but not throughout the world. Not throughout the nation. Not in places like Idaho or Wyoming. Not in places like New Mexico or Alaska. Electoral College says that by giving each state the right to have that election, that having the popular vote there, and having each state give the winner of that popular vote within that state a number, it allows for people in that state to make a case. The Electoral College is not the problem. The biggest problem we have right now is we've got a two-party system that doesn't give us real alternatives. The problem that we have now is that we have party political machines in both parties in the local party making rules that favor the candidates that they like. What we have going on now is we've got legitimately party caucuses in each state and superdelegates mattering more than a popular vote. Excuse me. It allows for party nepotism to come into play. That has nothing to do with Electoral College or how those votes count. It merely says that a state shouldn't be judged by how many people live in it. Obviously, there are problems that we face because of the Electoral College. It isn't the fault of the Electoral College, but it's the fault of things that have happened because politicians and parties have been trying to take advantage of the system. And one of that has been gerrymandering, rigging the districts. That's been probably the biggest problem. But other than that, it's the closest thing we have to ensuring that a state matters. That it matters to vote in the West, especially in the West. Because if we have popular vote, we give up after Ohio, and whoever lives, we're not going to even start to count the votes for Ohio. Maybe afterwards, but it doesn't matter. It won't really play an impact. The Electoral College is the closest thing we can have to what we really should have. In a true Republican-style government, which is what we're supposedly supposed to have, which drives me up a wall whenever people say we live in a democracy, because it's not true, would be for us to vote for our local leaders and have them vote for president. That's how it went the first time around. It would give states more power. You get rid of the Electoral College and it will get rid of any shot of states being able to advocate things. It would also mean that we would have more problems like the hanging Chad of 2000 if we didn't have the Electoral College. We would have more lawsuits. And it would be harder to kind of get a sense of how we're getting that information collected. The way it is now with the Electoral College, you have your popular vote and your in the general election in your state for president. Those results get sent in, and we're shown who wins the state. And when we project a winner, and when we find out who wins the state, they get the electoral votes. The other problem we have is we have a country that's so divided and is so polarized that we would have to be talking about margins, and that's where the lawsuits would come into play. We'd be arguing over thousands and hundreds of thousands of votes. And where would you be able to find where those votes were allegedly, right? You know, with the Electoral College and the way it goes now, that if you have a state that has any kind of issues, you see it more specifically. You don't get to even understand that you have a hanging Chad problem in Florida if you don't have the Electoral College. It's real simple, folks. So to those who are out there talking about it, I would just hope that they would get educated on that. All right. Our last segment of the show, we're talking about Craig Groeschel. He's a pastor, if you want to use that word. He's a mega church pastor, which means he allocates his duties to ministry leaders, quote unquote. And then, he may give a sermon once a month, or he may give a nice little prep talk to the other assistant ministers, whatever. Okay. He was talking about the forbidden phrase when it comes to church leaders, and really in church pastors, and this is actually some sound advice. It's pretty rich wisdom to have. He says that people who start saying our people, our children, our leaders, when they start saying that, they start saying it's something like we didn't do it, our folks didn't do it, that it takes the blame from the top leaders. It takes away responsibility from people who should be in top leading. And he suggests in his podcast, I read about his podcast from the Christian Post, and of course you can find his podcast on YouTube. Just find the YouTube channel life.church. It's kind of a weird name, like Life Period. It's like the artist formerly known as Prince. It's the church formerly known as Life, Pi, whatever. Anyways, he says that the real thing that you have to do is say, I didn't get our vote or people in. I didn't teach them something, so they got it wrong. I didn't tell them correct doctrine, and so, it uses these examples. And this is what needs to happen, especially in Orthodox confessional Reformed churches. Obviously, this is not so much of a problem that you'd face in the Orthodox or the Catholic Church, but in evangelical cycles, and more importantly, evangelical Reformed churches. That's an important distinction there. Leaders have to say, we're not doing this, I'm not doing this, I didn't teach this right, I didn't do this right. And it's all about accountability. And I gotta give the guy credit. I probably don't agree a lot with his theology. He tends to make people not members, but partners, whatever the heck that means. But he has sound wisdom here. Because the problems that we have in the Christian church are really about not taking accountability and not being willing to exercise a little Christian discipline. Again, liberalism has seeped into Christianity, not just in certain doctrinal stances, but in just the way we deal with the polity of the church, how we deal with people in general in the church. Well, we don't have enough people to go to this church. No. You can't think that way. The reason is, you know what? You have to understand that there's a responsibility at your church. And if you're a church leader, if you're a pastor, you got to understand that you have to ensure that you're teaching your flock the right stuff. You're not allowing them to digest anything that comes out of the mouth of Joel Osteen or anybody else, for that matter. And if you have problems, you have to understand that division comes from a lack of leadership. And we've done a lot within the Reformed Christian Church to, reduce that, right? We've done a lot to try to make our churches more democracy. I hate democracy. I think democracy is a tyranny, really. One of my favorite quotes from a movie is The Patriot, and Mel Gibson's character says in that, you're just as much, in trouble with one tyrant 3,000 miles away as you are 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away. I love that quote, and it's so true. We have to take accountability. And in our culture, in our society, that's becoming difficult. I mean, we can't even speak critically anymore. We can't even say what is what is. We're so afraid of our people being upset because you're going to tell them something they don't want to hear. It's going to offend their feelings. We need to get back to saying whatever is because that's the truth. And the truth is, I've enjoyed doing this podcast, and I've poured my heart into it. I took a lot. I've had to re-record stuff. I've had to cut out stuff, but I hope I've done my best doing it, the best I could. I want to wrap up this, and wrap up what we've talked about in this podcast by saying this. There are reasonable considerations to be made on both sides of the transgender bathroom issue. What exactly they are, well, it's kind of hard to say in a vacuum. Maybe instead of getting at each other's throats, we could actually sit down and talk about what everybody needs. And instead of refusing to open up your office or business in that state of North Carolina, and instead of refusing to do concerts, maybe you do the opposite. Maybe you go and you do a fucking concert there, and then speak truth to people. Because I wonder how the LGBT people in North Carolina feel that they don't get to see the boss. Or people who would have enjoyed having him there to boost them up, if that was how they were feeling. And stop praising him, and stop saying that he's any different than the Christian baker or the Christian florist who decides to do it. Who decides to not do business with someone because of a disagreement. I'm not upset that Bruce did what he did. He felt he had to do something, and you know what? Fine. Stand on your convictions. But don't be a hypocrite. And don't use inflammatory language that causes you to only make the issue more emotional than it needs to be. And I get it. It's hard to not make it emotional. But you have to. Otherwise, we'll never find a solution. And liberals, you're not what we need for justice warriors, because the concept of being a social justice warrior is absurd. Stop telling me I've got white privilege when you're pushing black privilege and LGBT privilege and saying it's about equality when it's not. Because the left isn't about equality, despite what it says. Fascism is comeback. I always say the 4 F's are the worst. Fascism, fundamentalism, feminism, and fanaticism. And they seem to all be nesting in the progressive LGBT, pro-LGBT community. I think for the sake of them and their community, and for people who are gay who may be willing to listen to reason and aren't hateful of people and understand it. Because you know what? Hey, I don't accept everyone's marriage. I don't accept everyone's lifestyle. But I understand it's their choice. To me, in the end, no matter how you dice it, no matter how you slice it, we're in for some trouble. And we ought to be concerned. And the fact that we're told that we're bigots because we have concern only tells me that we cannot rely on progressive, secular leftists as the voice of reason anymore. That's all I have for you. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Find out more information about me at my website, jlmoseman.net. Please be safe. I hope you enjoy your week. I will make up for the delay on the podcast. I promise. I have done everything I can to put everything I thought was relevant and cut out the excess fat from my much-needed podcast diet. Thank you all. Have a good one. This is J.L. Moseman.